Welcome to NTD News. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Here are today's top stories. Homeland Security is set to send out extra protection for national monuments over Independence Day weekend. The agency expects more targeted attacks over the holiday. Top Republican senators take a skeptical view of recent Russia bounty reports. The senators spoke following a briefing by the White House. Virus unemployment aid might end a week early for some Americans. It depends on where you live and your state's final payment date. Two Democrat Senate primary winners were announced yesterday. It sets the scene for a couple of high-profile Senate races in November. And Hong Kong police have arrested at least 9 people in the hours following the passing of Beijing's new law. Under the draconian law, protesters can be charged for waving flags and chanting slogans. And if convicted, they may face life behind bars. Homeland Security is taking extra measures to protect statues and monuments over Independence Day weekend. The agency will deploy teams to disperse rioters and stop takedown attempts.
The Department of Homeland Security is taking extra precautions. It's sending agents to protect monuments from potential July 4th vandalism. Teams of agents will be stationed in Portland, Seattle, and Washington, D.C. over the weekend. Other teams will be placed regionally to be flown into problem areas as needed. Homeland Security Secretary Chad Wolf mentioned the agencies involved in a tweet, naming the Federal Protective Service, ICE, the Secret Service, Customs and Border Protection, and the TSA. The Federal Protective Service will be on heightened alert. FPS agents will guard federal facilities from potential unrest, and Homeland Security will send in reinforcements as needed. Attacks on federal monuments increased as an offshoot to the George Floyd protests. President Trump responded by issuing an executive order that enforces 10-year jail sentences for statue and monument vandals. He wrote on Twitter, "My executive order to protect monuments, statues, etc. is in full force and effect," and noted that many people are now under arrest. He also chided state and local governments for not doing more to protect monuments.
Top Republican senators cast doubt on Russia bounty reports that appeared in major newspapers in recent days. They say what concerns them is that these reports were made based on unverified information.
Top Republican senators give their opinions on the claims made in mainstream newspapers, including the New York Times and the Washington Post. The newspapers reported that Russia paid the Taliban bounties to kill members of the U.S. Armed Services, and that the president was briefed on this. But Senate Armed Services Chairman Jim Inhofe disputes this claim.
This is something that I know the press likes to think the president knew about this and didn't say anything. It was a cover-up. He didn't know about it, and I'm convinced of that.
The senators got a chance to hear the intel for themselves at a White House briefing.
And after that briefing, the evidence that I have seen and have heard shows no corroboration between what was posted in the New York Times article. So that is very concerning.
Another senator shared this concern that the major newspaper report was misleading.
Those major national newspapers I mentioned, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, reported on unverified and inconclusive intelligence, as though it had been conclusively determined.
House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy said that he, too, was not briefed before about the inconclusive intelligence. But it went further. He said that even as a member of top senators known as the Gang of Eight, who are usually briefed on sensitive information that the rest of Congress is not privy to, he was not briefed on it.
Here's a heads up. Extra unemployment aid could end a week early for some, depending on where you live. It comes down to a payment timing issue. And we have some good news for small businesses.
The extra $600 a week in virus unemployment aid might end early for some Americans. Under the CARES Act, additional benefits are supposed to stop at the end of July. But some states, like California and New York, are terminating the payments a week early. For many states, the last day for paying benefits this month ends on Saturday or Sunday, July 25th or 26th. But according to the CARES Act, Friday, July 31st is the final paying day. In the U.S., over 40 million people have lost work due to the CCP virus pandemic. Many businesses are hurting from stay-at-home orders and reopening restrictions. The small business aid program, called the Paycheck Protection Program, was also about to expire this week. But with just hours to spare, the Senate unanimously passed an extension to the program. The move came Tuesday night, extending the PPP to August 8th. The program was set to expire with more than $130 billion in allocated funds that were left unused. The program provides aid to small businesses struggling during the virus pandemic. The Democrat-controlled House of Representatives must also approve the extension. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell said a full economic recovery is unlikely until people feel safe going outside. Congress has signed off on about $3 trillion in aid so far, but policymakers say more will be needed.
The new free trade agreement among the U.S., Mexico, and Canada, USMCA, goes into effect today.
The USMCA includes new provisions for digital commerce, more stringent rules of origin for auto parts, and new minimum wage requirements for certain auto workers. It replaces NAFTA. The deal was signed by the three countries' leaders in November 2018. The deal was one of President Trump's key campaign points in 2016. Mexico's current president Andrés Manuel López Obrador says he will travel to Washington in July to meet with President Trump as a way to celebrate the deal. López Obrador also says he hopes Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau will join them.
Two Democrat Senate primary winners were announced yesterday for Colorado and Kentucky. It sets up a couple of high-profile election showdowns as Democrats try to win back the Senate.
Former Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper won the state's Democratic U.S. Senate nomination. Hickenlooper led by nearly 20 percentage points over progressive challenger Andrew Romanoff, who supported Medicare for All and the Green New Deal. Hickenlooper's victory set up a high-profile election showdown with Republican Senator Cory Gardner. Gardner is widely viewed as the most vulnerable Senate Republican. Beating Gardner is vital to the Democratic Party's hopes of regaining Senate control in November. National Democrats recruited Hickenlooper after his failed presidential campaign last year. He was expected to easily win in Colorado, but he was bogged down with ethical violations and campaign missteps. And in Kentucky, the Democrat winner for the U.S. Senate nomination was also announced. Establishment-backed Amy McGrath narrowly won against progressive Charles Booker. Voting ended last week, but results were delayed because of a deluge of mail-in ballots, and it was a tight race. She will challenge Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell in November. McGrath is seen as a moderate Democrat. She accuses McConnell of being a Washington insider, and McConnell accuses her of being too liberal for Kentucky. But Kentucky's Senate race could come down to President Trump, who remains popular in the state. McConnell defended the president after House Democrats impeached him. McGrath said she would have voted to convict President Trump on both counts. Utah and Oklahoma also held nominating contests Tuesday, primarily by mail-in ballot.
The Supreme Court ends a Montana law that prevented students at religious schools from receiving public scholarship money. Some justices see the law as discriminatory.
The U.S. Supreme Court ruled Montana violated the Constitution's First Amendment by excluding religious schools from a state-funded scholarship program. The 5-4 decision is seen as a victory for the Trump administration and its support for the school choice movement. All except 2 justices filed opinions on the case, suggesting passions may have run high during deliberation. The petitioners in the case are 3 low-income mothers who needed scholarship funds to keep their children in a Montana Christian school. The state ruled that the families could not receive the funds since their children attended a religious school. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote that a state doesn't have to subsidize education, but if it chooses to do so, it cannot discriminate against religious schools. Some of the justices traced the Montana law back to the failed Blaine Amendment, a constitutional amendment that sought to deny public aid to schools with religious ties. Although failing at the federal level, many states have adopted similar laws. Some of the justices say the Blaine Amendment was rooted in religious bigotry and hostility towards Catholics specifically.
In France, healthcare workers emerging from the country's virus crisis to protest for better pay. They say their conditions hamper their efforts to give the care that's needed. Our France correspondent David Vives has the story.
Hundreds of healthcare workers marched in Paris on June 30th, renewing a call on the government to provide sufficient financing to hospitals nationwide.
Despite being praised with daily applause by people on their balconies during the height of the outbreak, health workers said they should instead be rewarded for their work with higher salaries and more funding for equipment and personnel.
We are underpaid and we live in a precarious situation.
We studied for 5 years and we are paid like someone who has 3 years of study. Moreover, it's hard for us to provide good quality care because of the poor working conditions.
France has one of the highest virus death tolls in Europe. Some unions blame the poor working conditions. For these two doctors working at Hospital PTA Salpêtrière, it's also about the conditions inside the public hospitals.
Public hospitals need more beds to welcome patients. It's a problem that has existed for years.
And there was a lack of equipment required, such as respiratory devices.
Last year, healthcare workers were striking and protesting against the government, but the movement was put on hold since the pandemic. They returned to the streets in June, sparking clashes with police after France lifted its 2-month lockdown in mid-May. The French government has promised to reform the healthcare system, which it says will involve massive investment and greater appreciation shown to healthcare workers. But labor unions say that's not enough. Reporting by David Vivez, NTD News, Paris.
Up next, a St. Louis City prosecutor says the couple seen brandishing their firearms in front of activists will be investigated. The couple's lawyer says they acted lawfully on private property. And a detective from LA formed a Mariachi Band with other officers in order to bring him closer to the local community. More on that when we return.
Hello there. Doesn't it feel like we're moving further away from the very values that our republic was built upon? And the media in our country has just been adding fuel to the flame, which is why you need to try the Epoch Times. It's pure, honest journalism that's restoring traditional values, and it reports the news with no spin, no hidden agendas, and no false narratives. So if you want to know the truth about the FISA abuse that took place during the 2016 election, or how socialist and communist ideologies have been infiltrating our society, or how the Chinese Communist Party's cover-up led to this global outbreak, and so much more, then you need to check out the Epoch Times. And for a limited time, you can try the paper yourself for a full month for just $1, and we'll send you a very special free gift. A giant timeline that's 3 feet by 4 feet, documenting the FBI's abuse of FISA spy warrants. So go to readepoch.com and claim yours today.
Two St. Louis lawyers are under investigation for brandishing their weapons in front of activists in a viral video. The couple say they were defending themselves from people who were trespassing on private property.
This incident between a couple and BLM activists who broke onto private property in St. Louis, Missouri is being investigated. A city prosecutor says she's alarmed that peaceful protesters were met with guns and a violent assault, so she's taking action.
Make no mistake, the Circuit Attorney's Office will not tolerate the use of force or intimidation to affect the rights of individuals to peacefully protest and to protect their First Amendment right. And I will use every extent of Missouri law to hold individuals accountable.
The lawyer of the couple, Mark and Patricia McCloskey, said in a statement that the actions of violence, destruction of property, and acts of threatening aggression of a few scared the family into taking out their firearms. He also said the McCloskeys acted lawfully as they were on their property in a private gated lane, Portland Place. Reports say the advocates were demanding for the resignation of the St. Louis mayor after she read the names and addresses of people calling to defund the police department during a Facebook live stream. They apparently decided to cut through the private gated lane on their way to the mayor's house. In an interview with local media, Mark said it isn't a protest if they kick in the gate to get in, that's a revolution. But he added that he supports the cause of Black Lives Matter. But looking at available videos, it's unclear when the gate was damaged and how. Miguel Moreno, NTD News.
Victims of Harvey Weinstein will get nearly $19 million as part of a class action settlement. The New York Attorney General's office filed a lawsuit in February of 2018 against a disgraced movie mogul and the Weinstein Company, claiming a hostile work environment. The AG says women employees who were threatened, harassed, and assaulted are now receiving some justice. As part of the agreement, the victims are released from confidentiality, non-disclosure, and non-disparagement agreements, meaning they can share their stories without fear of retribution. The bankruptcy and district courts must sign off on the settlement. Weinstein's attorney says he will appeal his criminal conviction. And in lighter news, a detective from LA formed a mariachi band with other officers to come closer to the local community. He said he was especially hurt in the past few weeks to see how people reacted to law enforcement.
Community engagement has always been on the mind of Chris Reza, a detective and police officer with the Los Angeles Police Department for 19 years. In 2017, Reza married his love for law enforcement with his passion for music when he formed the Mariachi Band, Los Servidores. It's a law enforcement mariachi band made up of members from various California police departments. He said the band helps to connect with the local community.
The reception that I had received and the way the community had reacted to me being able to sing in uniform at community events was a great way to interact with the community and build bridges that way.
It is a natural combination for Reza. His mother performed at parties when he was growing up. Law enforcement runs in the family too. His two older brothers are police officers with the LAPD. The recent demonstrations and widespread outcry for police reform rattled Detective Reza. He said it was hurtful for him to see how people reacted.
You're being judged not by your personal actions, beliefs, or anything that they know about you, but you're being judged as a whole.
The mariachi band Los Servidores is not for profit. Reza says it's a challenge to coordinate schedules to rehearse and perform with the band, but it's worth it to be able to connect with people.
Coming up, the president of Taiwan says that what is happening in Hong Kong proves that the one country, two systems formula is not feasible for Taiwan. More on that when we return.
When you look at TV networks in America, a soundbite and fight-it-out culture prevails on news and commentary programs. As a Canadian, I'm fascinated with America, and I wanted to offer American thought leaders an opportunity to share their thoughts in a deep dive format where we can explore their ideas together. And so American Thought Leaders was born. The world's most brilliant thinkers believed that open discourse was the key to greatness. However, all around the world, we see that discourse is being stifled and political agendas have subverted media. The Epoch Times launched its Global Thought Leaders program to bring back this great tradition of free thought. As the host of American Thought Leaders, every week I interview some of the most intriguing minds on the most pressing issues of our time. Be sure to check out our new episodes every week.
Hong Kong police have already started acting on the greater powers given to them by Beijing's national security law. They're arresting protesters for waving flags, holding banners, or chanting pro-democracy slogans, deemed forms of secession or subversion by the new law. At least 9 arrests have been made so far.
Less than 24 hours after Beijing imposed its draconian national security law on Hong Kong, police began making arrests. Riot police detained a man and a woman separately, both for holding pro-independence flags in the first act suspected of violating the new law. If convicted, the 2 offenders could be imprisoned for life. Police confronted protesters who gathered to mark 23 years since Britain handed over the city to Chinese rule. Thousands gathered. Some were arrested by fully armed riot police. Others suffered the effects of pepper spray. Water cannon trucks also took to the streets. The police were seen holding a banner, warning that holding flags, banners, and even chanting slogans could lead to arrest and prosecution. Hong Kong police reported that over 70 arrests were made for participation in what they called unauthorized assemblies and other related offenses, including 2 for suspectedly violating the national security law. But the protests continued. Placards were handed out, and amongst banners denouncing the Chinese Communist Party. This resident says Hong Kong has already become another mainland Chinese city, while this resident says the new law makes Hong Kongers feel afraid and insecure about their future.
We know what the mainland judiciary is like, their political attitude, and how they handle things. So the law makes Hong Kong people afraid rather than making us feel safe.
According to Pan-Democrat legislator Dennis Kwok, that is exactly what Chinese authorities aim to achieve by passing this law.
Do not let fear be driven into your hearts, because this is exactly what they want to do. Drive fear into the hearts of the Hong Kong people, who aspire for freedom and democracy.
He says if Hong Kong's people succumb to fear, their battle for freedom will be lost.
Taiwan's president says she is very disappointed by the law imposed on Hong Kong. She said it proves that the one country, two systems formula is not feasible for the mainland together with Taiwan.
Mainland China once promised Hong Kong that they wouldn't change its system for 50 years. The passing of the national security law indeed broke this promise. We feel very disappointed. This also proves that one country, two systems doesn't work.
President Tsai Ing-wen was the first government leader anywhere to pledge measures to help Hong Kong people who wish to leave due to the tightening controls by the communist regime. The contentious law targets crimes of secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forces. If prosecuted, offenders face up to life in prison, heralding a more authoritarian era for the Asian financial hub. The law was widely condemned in democratic Taiwan. Taiwan opened an office to help Hong Kongers leaving the region.
The establishment of this office not only expresses Taiwan's support for Hong Kong's democracy and freedom, but also manifests the determination of our concern for Hong Kongers.
They also hope to seize the opportunity to attract professionals and capital from Hong Kong. So far, about 200 people already fled to Taiwan from Hong Kong since pro-democracy protests began last year. Taiwan's Mainland Affairs Council chairman warned that Beijing aims to target people in other countries with the law. The law covers permanent and non-permanent residents of Hong Kong.
The so-called Hong Kong National Security Law not only targets residents in Hong Kong, it's also an order issued by the empire to people all over the world.
Taiwan shares with the Hong Kong protesters a deep antipathy for the Chinese regime. China's communist leaders have never renounced the use of force to bring Taiwan under its control. Beijing denies stifling Hong Kong's freedoms and has condemned Taiwan's plans to help people there.
And still to come, an Israeli startup has developed a machine that can 3D print plant-based meats. They say the specialized printers can create any cut and as much as 10 pounds per day. More on that when we return. Volvo just announced its biggest recall ever for over 2 million vehicles worldwide. It found that a steel wire connected to front seatbelts can be weakened. The steel cable anchors these seatbelts to the car. A company spokesman says it can wear and tear under special conditions, reducing protection. He says it's a very rare problem. Volvo says the safety recall is to avoid future issues. It affects several models manufactured between 2006 and 2019. No current models are included in the recall. There are no reports of accidents or injuries linked to the wire. And in other news, an Israeli startup has developed a machine that makes a plant-based version of any cut of meat. They say it's a way to help more people eat plant-based food.
Israeli startup Redefine Meat plans to launch 3D printers to produce plant-based steaks next year. It mimics real beef in a bid to win a slice of the fast-growing alternative meat market. Although there are already many meat alternatives on the market, the CEO of Redefined Meat is confident they can offer more than their competitors.
So we're introducing a new category. We can do the entire cow, not only one part of the cow that is actually side stream. Steaks, roast, slow cooking, grilling, everything that an animal can do, we want to do the same or even better.
Plant-based meat products are becoming increasingly popular with consumers worried about animal welfare and the environment. But how exactly does it work to 3D print meat?
We analyze the different components that make those beautiful cuts and try to figure out which are the key components that we need to mimic in order to achieve those beautiful cuts of meat. We identified three main components: the muscle, the blood, and the fat. These are the components that we need to mimic in order to reach the perfect, beautiful steak.
Redefined Meat will first market test its alt steak at high-end restaurants later this year before rolling out its industrial-scale 3D printers to meat distributors in 2021. It can currently print about 10 pounds of meat an hour, but the machines it will launch will be able to print over 40 pounds an hour next year, and eventually hundreds of pounds at a lower cost than real meat.
The idea is to replace a cow. So each of our machines produce in a day exactly like a cow, up to 250 kilos in a single day.
Israel has numerous alternative meat startups. Aleph Farms developed lab-grown steak and expects to have a biofarm operational in late 2022. Meat Tech 3D is combining 3D printing with the lab meat process. Spanish competitor Nova Meat is also working on 3D printed plant meat, including a whole muscle pork cut developed during the pandemic that disrupted pork supply. Diners at a Tel Aviv steakhouse welcome the idea of replacing meat with plant-based solutions, as soon as the taste is as good, that is.
And still to come, a family from Wisconsin swoops in to help a bear in need. They discovered him swimming in a lake during a family boat trip. See the rescue in action when we return. A family from Wisconsin made a rather unusual discovery during a trip on their boat. They crossed paths with a helpless bear who had a plastic tub stuck on his head and quickly rushed to the rescue.
Tricia Hurt, her husband Brian, and their son Brady just so happened to be at the right place at the right time this past weekend in Wisconsin. They helped rescue a young bear swimming in the Marsh Miller Lake in Chippewa County. The bear had managed to get a cheese ball tub stuck on its head, and they caught it all on video. The father, Brian, said the chances of them meeting the bear were so slim, he should have bought a lottery ticket that day.
I would have better chances of winning the lottery ticket than stumbling across that poor bear.
It was around sunset on Saturday when they spotted the bear. They drove up next to it and tried to pull the slippery plastic tub off, at first unsuccessfully.
I had the damn thing. I know. Just get around him. Get back on the other side of him.
He almost got it off.
I know he did.
One more pull and I would have had him.
But another pass proved successful.
We saved our little bear.
Good job, buddy.
Swim happy.
Brian said they watched the bear from afar after the rescue. Now free from the tub, it went to the shore, laid down, and quickly passed out from the exhaustion. Brian said that's when they knew the bear was safe.
If you've ever wondered what space smells like, a new perfume may give you some idea. A fragrance called Ode to Space brings the scent of outer space down to Earth.
The fragrance was developed by a chemist named Steve Pierce. Pierce was originally contracted by NASA to recreate the smell in 2008, and it took him approximately 4 years to develop it. Astronauts described the smell as a mix of gunpowder, seared steak, raspberries, and rum. According to Kickstarter, NASA's goal with the fragrance was to help astronauts train before launching into orbit. Now they want to release the fragrance to the world. Eau de Space are also looking to release a fragrance called Smell of the Moon.
And that's the end for our broadcast audience. But for those watching online, we'll continue live after the break. New York City's police department is facing a $1 billion cut to next year's budget. The city council voted to pass the budget change after midnight, but protesters who've occupied City Hall for over a week say they won't settle for it. They're demanding the police force be completely abolished. NTD's Melina Weisskopf has more.
New York City Council has approved a major budget change, the redirection of $1 billion of the NYPD's $6 billion budget. It will instead go towards youth programs, education, and family and social services.
By ensuring that the NYPD will make revisions in some of the functions it performs.
But for some, it's not enough. These New Yorkers are still outside of City Hall after camping out for more than a week. They're calling for complete abolishment of the police department.
We believe in abolition, but we understand that this is a step towards that.
Graffiti covers the streets and walls of New York's government buildings. The zone resembles the so-called Chop Zone in Seattle, where multiple shootings have happened over the past week. On Tuesday, authorities started removing the barricades there to open the zone up.
No, so far we've let people know that come Sunday that some of these barriers were going to be removed, and so now this is just part of that process.
It comes after 2 teenage boys were shot on Monday. One died, marking the second death in the area. The other is in the hospital with severe wounds. We asked the New York protesters occupying City Hall how they plan to handle similar violence if it erupts.
We have organized de-escalation teams, and we have folks who are here in principle, who are on security, but people who understand that Black Lives Matter.
What would this response be?
We don't know.
It certainly depends on the situation, right? I would use my my experience even as a high school teacher and understanding how to de-escalate conflict situations if I could.
I would try to gather the groups together.
One young woman told us she doesn't think violence like what happened in Seattle will break out in New York. Shortly after, this happened.
Suck you, daddy!
You want to film something productive.
The woman who covered our camera urged us not to film the incident. Moments later, another heated dispute broke out, with a group of people attacking this man. Protesters are still clustered around City Hall. One organizer said they plan to stay until the funds are allocated, or maybe even longer. Reporting from New York, Melina Weisskopf, NTD News.
The American Academy of Pediatrics says kids need to be back in the classroom when schools open again in the fall. The Academy represents and guides pediatricians across the country. Its update comes after states revealed their plans for getting 56 million students back to school. According to the AAP's website, the benefits of in-class learning outweigh the risks of the CCP virus. The group also said schools are probably not the ones accelerating the virus spread, and that children are less likely to become extremely sick from the virus than adults. To lower the risk of contagion, the AAP recommends elementary school grades focus on washing hands and going outside as much as possible. They say middle and high school grades should be required to cover their face if a 6-foot distance cannot be maintained. The top allergy and infectious diseases expert, Dr. Anthony Fauci, has also suggested that keeping schools closed in general isn't necessary. And in other news, a Hong Kong lawmaker calls the new national security law the end of the one country, two systems framework. Our reporters spoke with two U.S. lawmakers who introduced bills to defend Hong Kong's autonomy. They told us how the security law will affect Hong Kongers and the way the world does business with the city.
Hong Kong has adopted a national security law that gives the Chinese regime the power to target individuals for secession, subversion, and terrorism. Offenders could be imprisoned for life. U.S. Representative Ted Yoho introduced a bill that would sanction individuals who undermine Hong Kong's autonomy. He says the security law will have ramifications for the international business community.
Because they're going to look at how China treats international law and agreements. And they're going to understand that they cannot just trust the communists. And there's going to be a massive divestment from Hong Kong in business and international trade, and it'll go to countries that honor and respect human rights.
Dozens of American executives said they plan to move assets and business operations out of Hong Kong in response to the security law, according to an American Chamber of Commerce survey.
Chinese government at all, but I think it's going to have a major impact on businesses that China depends on, because these businesses will have to choose: do we do business with a communist repressive regime that you can't trust, or do we take our business elsewhere? And this plays into what we've been talking about for the last 3 years, about our policy of manufacturing the ABC method, which is manufacture anywhere but China. So these businesses.
Some respondents to the survey listed Singapore, Japan, and Taiwan as alternatives to Hong Kong amid fears of the city coming under authoritarian rule. Senator Pat Toomey introduced the Hong Kong Autonomy Act in the Senate. The bill sanctions those who materially contribute to undermining the joint declaration, which gives the city its autonomy. That includes police officials who crack down on protesters or communist officials responsible for the national security law. He says there are other ways to make sure his bill passes.
There is also another legislative path that we could take to getting this legislation enacted, and that would be to include it as a part of another piece of legislation, such as the National Defense Authorization Act, which we are considering in the Senate this week and maybe next week.
Representative Yoho expects the Autonomy Act to be signed into law this Congress session. Reporting by Kitty Wong and Kevin Hogan, NTD News.
A city in central England is back on strict lockdown after a CCP virus flare-up. About 10% of all new cases in England are from the city. NTD UK's Neil Woodrow will bring us more news from Europe.
Thanks. Welcome to NTD UK, bringing you UK and European news. A city in the UK is back on strict lockdown after a CCP virus flare-up. It's the first time England has imposed local measures to curb an outbreak.
In Leicester and central England, all non-essential shops are again closed and schools will follow on Thursday. Travel to and from the city is also being restricted.
We'll send further testing capability, including opening a walk-in centre. Anyone in Leicester with symptoms must come forward for a test.
Some residents blame the outbreak on residents ignoring restrictions.
I think if people listen and stay at home, they don't want to be in here, so I think you just got to be extra vigilant and careful now.
Leicester has a large immigrant population, so the government is providing extra funding for translation services. Nearly 1,000 people tested positive for the virus in Leicester over a 2-week period, giving it an infection rate 3 times higher than the next highest city. The area now accounts for 10% of all new cases in England.
The measures are particularly tough since starting July 4, the rest of England enters the next phase of reopening. Leicester, meanwhile, is going in the opposite direction. To UK budget airline EasyJet, it may close 3 of its 11 airport bases in Britain as it struggles to stay alive. The airports include London Stansted, Southend airports and Newcastle in northeast England. Over 700 pilots could be cut, or about 1/3 of its pilots in the country. EasyJet said in May it needed to cut 4,500 jobs to stay competitive amid the pandemic travel slump. The company says it doesn't expect demand to return to pre-pandemic levels until 2023. On to the economy. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is planning a big spending economic recovery plan, inspired, he says, by US President Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Johnson says the UK cannot continue to be prisoners of the pandemic and is preparing to move on.
He's planning a $6 billion New Deal to build homes and infrastructure.
To unite and level up. And to that end, we will build. Build back better, build back greener, build back faster.
Johnson also promises to invest in poorer regions outside of London and southeast England.
And in those towns that feel left behind, we have plans to invest in their centres. New academy schools, new green buses, new broadband.
Johnson has ambitious plans for the UK to become a science superpower, including making the world's first zero-emission long-haul passenger jet. And the ongoing tech issue. Britain's Media Secretary Oliver Dowden says US sanctions aimed at China's Huawei will likely impact Huawei's viability in Britain. The sanctions require companies using US chip-making equipment to get a license if they want to sell semiconductors to Huawei. In January, the UK granted Huawei a limited role in its future 5G networks. The US sanctions came in May, triggering a review by the National Cybersecurity Centre. The government is now reviewing that analysis. Dowden said, off the back of that, we will determine what policy measures, if necessary, need to be taken in response. And drug trials. British regulators have approved restarting a global trial of anti-malaria drugs hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine to see if they can prevent infection with the CCP virus. The study is a randomised placebo-controlled trial. The goal is to enrol 40,000 healthcare workers and other at-risk staff globally. Studies of the drugs as a potential preventative medicine had not yet given a conclusive answer. Results are expected by the end of the year. To France, where France's former Prime Minister François Fillon received a 5-year jail sentence for embezzling public funds. Fillon's wife Penelope was also found guilty for her role in the scam.
The charges relate to Fillon's 2017 run for French president. His wife received about $1.1 million for minimal work as his parliamentary assistant. The court said the couple had failed to prove what work Penelope did and had amassed wealth as a result of the scam. The Fillon's defence lawyer says they will fight the charges.
This decision, which is not fair, will be appealed. We are doing that now, and there will be a new trial.
Because 3 years of Fillon's 5-year sentence are suspended, he can avoid jail time while the appeal is pending. His wife received a suspended 3-year sentence. The court also convicted a third co-defendant, Marc Joulot, to a suspended 3-year sentence. Joulot continued to pay Penelope as an assistant when he took over her husband's parliamentary seat. The court ordered the Fillons to pay $450,000 in damages to the National Assembly. Penelope Fillon and Joulot were also fined a further $760,000. Trevor Piper, NTD News.
And after 43 years, France's oldest nuclear power plant is now offline. Operated by state-run utility EDF, it produced 70% of the power for the northeastern region of Alsace. For decades, environmental activists targeted the plant near the German and Swiss borders, complaining the area was prone to earthquakes and flooding. Local residents are unhappy. The facility is the region's biggest source of employment. Over 2,000 jobs will be affected. France has pledged to reduce its reliance on nuclear power, which currently supplies about 75% of the nation's energy needs. It's not yet clear how the energy gap will be filled. That's all for today from our NTD UK newsroom. Back to New York.
Thank you, Neil. And that's all for now. Thanks for tuning in. Catch up again at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time. I'm Tiffany Meyer.